I found a story about a man that boarded on a train, and he said to the conductor, "Sir, I have a very important job interview tomorrow morning in Atlanta. It's imperative that I get off the train when it goes through town. The problem is," he says, "I'm a very heavy sleeper, and I'm afraid I'm going to sleep right through it. Could you please wake me up?" Well, he agreed. He said, "Sure, that's no problem." And he tells him, "But you got to understand, I am a very deep sleeper. And I'm positive when you wake me up at 2 in the morning, I'm not going to want to get up. I'm not going to know what's going on. I'll give you a $100 tip and make sure that I get off the train." So he agreed, and he went and laid down to go to sleep. And later that morning, he woke up. It was around 6 a.m., and he was in Charlotte, North Carolina instead. And he was furious. He couldn't believe it. He went looking for the conductor, and he shouted and says, "You said you'd wake me up 4 hours ago. Oh, do you know how angry I am?" The conductor replied, "Well, probably about as angry as that man that I threw off the train back in Atlanta." Yeah, oops. So think back through this last week. Just going to do just a quick little survey, and don't be shy. I think we're going to kind of be all in the same boat. But was it a good week or was it a tough week? So think back. Did you have a bad week? Who said they had a bad week? It was kind of tough. Okay. How about just a day? You know you had a bad day. There was at least a day in there. It was just really bad. Okay. Well, we're still missing a few hands. So how about, can anybody remember just a bad experience? Somewhere in the week, you know you had a bad experience, okay? Something went wrong and it was tough. All right. It's a pretty shared fact of life. And we go through tough times. We're going to get into the book of Daniel, or the story of Daniel. We're doing this series called Sunday School Lessons, All Growed Up. And we're trying to take a little bit of a fresh look at some of these old stories that have been told to kids in Sunday school class over the years. And we're going to look at Daniel and talk about a guy that's had a tough experience, tough day, tough week, tough month, tough year, tough life. He was in a situation that was really difficult. In fact, I want to give you a little bit of history just to set this up for you this morning. If you don't know much about Daniel, there's a book in the Old Testament called Daniel. It's the title of the book. It's mostly about Daniel's life, although it discusses some other areas. And it was written by Daniel. It's broken down into two main parts. The first 6 chapters are largely historical writings explaining how Daniel came to be a part of the court of Nebuchadnezzar, and even Daniel's rise in importance and power as a kind of an advisor, if you will. The last 6 books are largely about visions that Daniel had regarding prophetic future events, and they were warnings and preparation and things to look for. Before we get into the story of Daniel, I found the reading that I did, some things that I was looking at. I found it rather interesting that those who might be critics of the Bible like to specifically point to the book of Daniel and believe that the book was not actually written by Daniel. There's a lot of criticism surrounding that Daniel did not write it. And the reasoning is, and I just find this so interesting, that the book is full of what they would say supposed prophecies about future events, and those prophecies are given in such detail and accuracy. They say that there's no way the book could have been written in the time period they say it was written by Daniel, and that it must have been written at a later date, and then Daniel's name put on it. In the 3rd century A.D., Porphyry of Tyre was a Greek philosopher And he worked pretty strongly against the book of Daniel and proclaiming that it had been written by somebody living more in the 2nd century BC. Daniel was written more in the 6th century BC. And he claimed it had to have been written in the 2nd century and specifically pointed at the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes. And his main claim was that the details in the book of Daniel about Epiphanes were very, very accurate. He says they were so accurate, there's no way that it was written down before the events happened. However, the Bible and other writings throughout history have repeatedly confirmed that the book was written, in fact, by Daniel. And it was written in the time period that it claims, around 600 BC up into 500 BC. So it was about 600 BC that King Nebuchadnezzar laid siege against Jerusalem, God's holy city. And eventually they overtake the city and they carry off thousands of skilled workers and Jewish nobility to the kingdom of Babylon. And effectively, Daniel was one of the men that was taken. And effectively, what they had done was they took over this mostly men and made them kind of slave labor force to build the kingdom of Babylon. So Daniel was one of those men taken. He was a prophet, and he had opportunity to correctly and miraculously interpret a dream that was bothering Nebuchadnezzar during that time. And the event afforded Daniel certain rights and privileges as an official in the king's court. So that's kind of how he rose up through importance and power. So he's a part of the slave labor in Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar is kind of terrified through some frightening dreams. Daniel is called upon to interpret the dream. He does so correctly, and the king Nebuchadnezzar awards him and raises him up to be an official in his court. This is all in the first couple of chapters of the book. We're actually going to pick up the story in Daniel chapter 5, and so I want to give you just a little bit of this background. Later, as a prophet to the king, he goes to the king and he tells the king that he is becoming increasingly prideful. And so he prophesied over the king that he was going to turn crazy and wander off from his kingdom and even dividing himself from everyone and even begin eating grass and foliage and so forth. And it happened exactly as Daniel said. Then later, after Nebuchadnezzar's death, his grandson becomes a co-regent with his father, Nebuchadnezzar's son and grandson. They become co-regents of the area, and his name was Belshazzar. And we're going to pick up the story of Belshazzar. As one night, Belshazzar is throwing this great party. He's so proud of the kingdom, and he's so proud of his authority, and he's so proud of where they're at, and to kind of show off his might and his wealth and his authority, he throws a huge party. It's a party that's even recorded throughout history, just the magnificence of it all. The Bible doesn't give us all the details, but apparently it was just so grand. They talked about ostriches that had trays of food, and they would pull them up and down the aisles. Thousands and thousands of lords came to this great party that they were throwing, and it was wild. Everybody was 3 sheets to the wind, and they even were. It was even the beginning of the party was so wild. It was the beginning of being overthrown, and the kingdom taken down by an enemy. But I want to pick up the story then in Daniel chapter 5, and it's at that party in verse 1. And if you have it, we'll read the first few verses, and keep your Bibles open, and we'll look at a few verses later on in just a minute. But in Daniel chapter 5, verse 1, it says that King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, then when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, and it says his father, but really the word there means more like predecessor. And so it's kind of like to say he's from the line of Nebuchadnezzar. And he was more likely his grandson. That his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem, and he brought that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem. Keep in mind where these vessels came from. And the king and his lord, they drank from they drank wine and praised the gods of the God of silver and of gold and bronze and iron, wood and stone. Immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. And then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. And so here's what's going on there. They're having this wild party, and they're caught up in this revelry, and he has this idea to celebrate their magnificence in Babylon, and that they had overtaken the region of Jerusalem. He calls for these grand vessels of gold and silver that were taken out of God's temple in Jerusalem to be brought in, that they could drink from them, mocking God and then praising and proclaiming their gods and idols. Then suddenly this hand shows up out of the shadows and begins writing on the wall. I think this morning I want to talk about kind of three characters in this story that we're going through. God, Belshazzar, and then Daniel, and hopefully glean something from each one. But we haven't got too much of Daniel's story yet, so we're going to pick that up in a minute. But first of all, let's think about God. And can I say to you that God is always in control?
Oh, yeah.
No matter what is going on, no matter what is happening, God is always in control. It may not always seem like it. We may wonder at times, where is he? What is he doing? Why is he waiting so long? But we see again and again in Scripture, God is always in control. It reminded me a little bit as I was thinking about that video clip we watched several weeks back about Bruce Almighty, and he had been fired from his job, and now he'd just been in an accident, and he's standing on the side of the road, and he's shaking his fist at heaven, and he's angry with God. And his name is Bruce Nolan. He looks to the sky, shaking his fist in the air, and he says, "You know, the only one around here not doing their job is you." And he says, "You're the one that should be fired," as he yells at God because he's so angry. And he thinks that everything's gone wrong. Everything's bad. Nothing's going the way he wants or the way he thinks it should. And maybe there's times that we think that way. Maybe there's times that we wonder, is there really a grand plan here? The captives from Israel have been exiled to another land, and they're forced to work as slave labor in a pagan society. They're the people of God, and here they're slaves in a pagan world, forced to worship pagan idols and gods. They had to be thinking, what's going on? God, I thought we were your people. I thought that you were for us and with us. I thought you would bless us and take care of us. But what we need to be reminded of this morning, whenever we're feeling that way, whenever we're thinking that way, whenever we think that everything has just gotten out of control, we need to be reminded that God is ready and God is able and God is willing to step into human history at any time that it suits his will and his purpose. Anytime he wants to do something that is according to his plan, he will do it. In this particular situation, God was actually using Babylon as kind of his agents of judgment against Israel. And there was even a reason, because Israel had fallen into sins and idolatry and rebellion against him. And so he was using Babylon and allowing this to take place as judgment against them. And so he's allowing this to go on. And yet in that we see that he never really left them. And he never really gave up on them. And it was all still moving towards his great and good plan. And even in this time of exile, God was demonstrating great miracles, incredible prophetic fulfillment. His faithful and chosen ones were rising up in influence amidst this very dark time. And anytime we feel the pressure of life, or that sense that things are going wrong, have gotten hard, we can always hold on to God and know that he's with us. And he's leading, and he's providing, and nothing is outside of his gaze. Nothing is outside of his control. You know, here at the church, a few of you know that we just went through a government audit. This is a surprise to us, and we go to great lengths to do the very best we can and deal with all of our stuff, but it turns out that we had improperly recorded a certain issue, and it was really just a technicality. But unfortunately, the report back to us was it was going to cost us $3,300. That was the original report that we received during this audit. That with back taxes, and then they were going to add fines and penalties, and then there was going to be fees and all this kinds of stuff. It was $3,300. And that's a shocker just to begin with. I'm sure that it wouldn't be hard to rile up this room about the distrust of government, and they don't deserve any more money of our money than they're already getting. And so we're facing this bill, this $3,300 bill, and it started off being just really frustrating. And we couldn't believe it because, we really thought and showed that we were doing everything right. It was like this technicality that they caught us on. But then I got to thinking about it, and we're praying through this, and what do we do, God? And I began looking at it, and actually started to become a little bit thankful because we had the money. 3 years ago, it would have bankrupted the church. Three years ago, we had emptied out our savings account just to keep the lights on. We were down to where we did not have an extra $3,000 to pay this bill, let alone do anything else. But today, we had plenty of money. We could write the check, and we would hardly even notice it was gone. Praise the Lord for his faithfulness as he's taken care of us these last few years. But then I had another thought. Just as we are getting ahead, just as we are making a little bit of ground, just as for the first time in all of my years of being, for the very first time, we feel like we're finally getting somewhere, and whammo, we get hit with something like this. And I was just mad all over again. Really? And then I thought about it more, and I prayed about it more, and I thought, maybe the reason we have the funds is because God knew what was coming, and he was preparing us. And before we ever got to a problem, before we ever got to the situation, he was making a way, and he was blessing us and taking care of us. And so we were ready, and we just stepped in faith that God would take care of our needs. And we asked the council and the finance team, please be praying about this. And we're going to go back and talk to them about a possible reduction and see if they'll help us. And we just got the final report, last Friday, we got the final report. Our new bill is $300, less than $300. God is always in control. And whatever you look at, whatever you see in the world around you that just seems like it's chaos, or you're facing problems, or you got stuff going on in your life, God is always in control. Whatever you're facing and dealing with. And so we just set our eyes on him. Now, second, we want to consider Belshazzar. He seems to be the spotlight of this story, this part of the story. Belshazzar is having this great party and a good old time, and it's all going wild and everything. And then he calls for these gold and silver vessels from the temple of God to be brought in so that they can continue to drink from them and kind of thumb their nose at God and give homage and praise to their gods and just continue this wild, drunken revelry. Well, they might as well have spit directly in the face of God, but God said, that's it, I'm not going to take any more. And this hand comes out of the shadows and begins to write on the wall. And it declares that Belshazzar is going to die, and his kingdom is going to be divided, and his reign and rule and rebellion are over. You know, some people live total wickedness and a rebellion against God and act like he doesn't see and he doesn't care. And unfortunately, that can only go on for a while. And here's a clear warning to everyone, to us in the church, to anyone else, that if you're living your life rebelliously against God, nothing escapes his view. He may allow it for a while. He may let it go on for a time. But we have to face the facts. We have to be reminded of the reality that God sees and God knows and God does care. And he'll hold us accountable. We used to remind the teenagers all the time of Numbers 32:23. We kind of like it because it's got a little bit of a twist in it. If you say Numbers 32 and flip it, it's 23. And it says, so it helps it to be easy to remember because of that little switch between the numbers. But it says, be sure your sin will find you out. You cannot thumb your nose at God and think that he doesn't care. You cannot live in disobedience and think that God does not see. We might question that for a time. Even some of the prophets of the Bible asked certain questions about the same kind of thing. Job, Jeremiah, the psalmist David, they all asked God, how is it? Why do you allow the wicked to prosper? They looked at life and says, it seems like doing bad gets you good things. It seems like wickedness fills your cup. It seems like you can do whatever you want and get away with it. God, how do you let this go on? But it's an illusion. God sees and God knows, and in his time, all will have to bow down before him. All have to make an account for their life. Philippians 2:10 and 11 says, at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. A day of reckoning comes for everyone. Here in Belshazzar's case, it came a little early. His rebellion, his revelry, at the height of his arrogance and pride, this hand appears out of the shadows and begins writing on the wall. Belshazzar is rightly terrified. He didn't know what it said, but he knew it was about him. And when God speaks to us and says, you can't go on this way, we know it's a message to us. You know, perhaps it's interesting to note that the phrase, the handwriting is on the wall, is still a fairly popular phrase in our vernacular, our vocabulary today. It has to do with the idea that something bad is about to happen. Something bad is coming. You know, so if you said, you know, maybe you're talking with a friend at work. Do you hear that they fired old George? Yeah, well, he never did do a good job, and I think the handwriting was on the wall for some time. Right? Luke Skywalker wanted to save his father Darth Vader from the dark side, but the handwriting was on the wall. He's got to die. The Arizona Cardinals think they're going to beat the Seahawks next week, but I think the handwriting is on the wall. And I got to admit, I had a little special joke in there for Grayson, but I already hit him once. I thought I'll let him by. The handwriting on the wall means that God has seen the wickedness, and he's stepping into your life, and nothing good will come of it. And it's a warning to Belshazzar. You can't live rebelliously against God. Lastly, we want to look at Daniel. And so we'll skip down to verse 10. And I found something just really interesting. You probably won't even care. I don't know. But we'll see. Verse 10. So everybody's terrified about this handwriting on the wall. They immediately call in their prophets, their magicians, their astrologers, their wise men to translate this inscription on the wall. And none of them they don't know what it says. So then the queen remembers about Daniel bringing a message to his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar. And so in verse 10 it says, the queen, because of the words of the kings and his lords, came into the banquet hall, and the queen declared, O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you, or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is a spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers. Because an excellent spirit of knowledge and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, who the king named Belshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show you the interpretation. So here's the interesting point to me. If you read through all the chapters of this book, at least mostly the first 6, and then I think there's another reference in chapter 9 or something. But a phrase actually repeats itself several times. And just a little Bible reading clue or tip, when you see phrases and words being repeated, it's oftentimes a clue that something important is there. Now, this particular phrase it has to do with the reoccurrences of how many times Daniel is referred to as being called Belshazzar. I think it's Belshazzar. Because that was the name the king gave him. So several times it says, call in Daniel, who is known as Belshazzar, because that was the name the king gave him. And I kept seeing it show up. It happens 6 times throughout the book. And it just kind of struck me as odd. Why was Daniel making such a big deal about this? Or I could just declare it's an interesting name. Daniel was named after one of the pagan gods that the Babylonians worshipped. The word actually means the prince of Baal. And if you know Old Testament history, you know Baal was one of the more common gods, pagan gods, that was worshipped, and lots of idols and lots of things centered around the belief in the deity of Baal. And so Daniel was given the nickname, if you will, or given the name Belshazzar by Nebuchadnezzar, the previous king. And so I thought about this, and that thought just repeated in my mind. Here you have the Jews, God's people. They've been defeated in battle. They've been taken as prisoners. They've been turned into slave labor force to build a foreign kingdom. And here we have Daniel being even renamed by one of their pagan gods. I mean, could you do any more just to kind of put rocks in his shoes? Well, they wore sandals, I guess. So rocks in his sandals. I mean, could you do any more just to goad him, just to get him, just to frustrate a guy, just to anger somebody, to be stripped of your home, to be forced to work as a slave in a foreign land, to build somebody else's kingdom, and then to be given the name of their God? And I just thought about all that. How did Daniel feel about that? I actually and I had a random thought. I don't know if that's God putting that in there, or was this even a weakness in Daniel? This is how they're treating me. I'm going to point it out over and over and over that they called me Belshazzar. But it kept kind of coming up. And it just seemed to be the height of mockery against a faithful follower of God. A faithful prophet of God. Somebody that did well in the eyes of God. And he still finds himself in this role. And it's so interesting, Daniel's demeanor as you watch and you look through it. Daniel was not going around stirring trouble, making problems. It's just that he was trying to be faithful under these difficult circumstances. I really appreciated what Jessica shared from the devotion this morning. That just in the mundane, in the everyday, sometimes we're just faithful, and God uses that. And it would be incredibly difficult to be living your life, being stripped from your home, your money and possessions taken away. It was mostly the men, so what other family was left back in Jerusalem as he was ripped away from them? And you're made to bow down, and you're supposed to worship their gods and their idols. And then even this idea that Daniel's given this new name, and Daniel had to figure out a way to deal with all that. And to not only deal with it, to remain courageous and to remain faithful and to remain strong in the Lord. And we didn't get to it. Perhaps Mark will mention this next week. He's going to take chapter 6, Daniel in the lion's den. But in chapter 6, it talks about how Daniel got away and he would kneel down and pray to the Lord 3 times a day. And it's no great secret from where he drew his strength. And this was not some kind of vain ritual and repetition. This was not some form of religious merit in trying to earn God's favor and blessings. Daniel was living in this extremely difficult land and difficult time, and he knew he needed to draw strength from the Lord. I remember a while back a pastor talking about an experience, and he had a member in his church that he really was impressed by the ministry influence that he was having in the workforce. And he asked him, could I spend a day with you and go to work? And he says, sure, that would be fine. And he apparently had a job. He could bring him along. And so the pastor was going to go to work with him. And he lived in the suburbs, rode a metro train into downtown area. And it was a little over an hour to get there. And so the pastor was kind of excited about this because he had an agenda. He wanted to go in and ride the train, and he figured he had an hour ride into town, another hour ride back home. He could really grill this guy with all the questions that were swirling in his mind about how did he do it? How did he evangelize? How did he make connections? How did he help people? What was his strategies? What was he doing? I mean, how did he get this all done? And he had just this whole list of questions to go over on the train ride. And they go in and they sit down in a spot, and the train takes off, and the pastor turns to his congregant member and he says, okay, I've got some questions for you. And the guy says, you can't ask those to me now. He says, this is my time to prepare for my day. And he spent the entire hour with his Bible and his journal and in quietness on the train, preparing for whatever God had him to do that day. It'd be, and this was a large church, and so if I said, could I spend the day with you and ask you questions about your ministry in the workplace, you would probably say, oh, God, I can't put up with that guy for a whole day. But this was a big church with a very well-known pastor. And if it were me, I'd be going, oh, man, he wants to spend time with me? He wants to ask questions about how I do ministry? Oh, my goodness, I'd be just so enthralled. And he's like, Pastor, this is not your time. This is God's time. And I'm going to let God refresh and fill my soul. Because when I get to work and when I see my friends, there will be things I have to deal with. There'll be problems to solve. There'll be conversations to have. There'll be stuff to take care of. Right now is when I find strength in the Lord. How easy it is for us to run off into our day with a long list of very important things and forget that our strength comes from the Lord. Daniel's in a tough spot, in a tough situation, and the only way he's going to make it through is by spending not daily time with the Lord, but 3 times a day spending time with the Lord in a private place, kneeling down and crying out to God for the strength that he needed in that day. What might you glean from this story today? Is it that you need to think about Daniel and you want to draw more strength from the Lord? Is it that you might need to think about Belshazzar and that God's eye is always upon us and he cares about how we live, about what we say, where we go, what we do? He cares about our life, and he's watching us. And we need to receive a little bit of a warning that reminds us to be mindful of him. Or maybe it's just to think of God's place in this story. That no matter what you face, no matter what you go through, he is always in control. And if this is a difficult season for you right now, you can still trust in him. Let's pray. Our Father, we give you thanks for this opportunity to worship this morning.